We've got about 10 or 12 minutes left, and I really think we ought to. I'm sure there's some avid Orwellians, and indeed Wavians, if that's the correct word.
It is, yeah.
I think we probably ought to open this to the floor if people would like to ask questions or to interject comments. There's a lady there. We've got a roving microphone, which Richard will hand out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for emphasising their interest in style and the English language. I'm sure that brought them together. The hatred of the modern world, to me, is summed up at the end of Scott King, where the headmaster says to Mr. Scott King, we don't want you to do classics anymore. It should be civics, because don't you think we must prepare the boys for the modern world? And Scott King says, no, it would be a very wicked thing to do, to prepare boys for the modern world. But the dumbing down of language, they would both have hated.
Oh, I think so. And it's amazing, really, how what a traditionalist Orwell was in his way. You know, there's great sort of huge romanticism about all this sort of bygone stuff. And he said, I mean, I have it on the authority of his first wife, Eileen's friend Lettice Cooper, the novelist, that when they adopted Richard Blair in 1940, Richard Blair, who of course came here last year and spoke about his relationship with his father, absolutely fascinating hour that was. And apparently Orwell's first remark, and this is Orwell, the class warrior, this is Orwell, the man who pretended that he hadn't been to public school and who tried to mingle. Orwell's first comment was that one, the boy, he should immediately be put down to Eton, and that secondly, they should have a proper pram with a gold line around the side.
Yes.
But I just think that's characteristic. I don't think that's a betrayal of any kind of principle. I just think that's the inner man declaring himself.
I do think that's so right. And in this Love Among the Ruins, again, the classical tradition is completely overlooked, and you don't get religion, but what you get state psychoanalyzed. So all children every fortnight get psychoanalyzed by the state, and of course he absolutely loathed psychoanalysis. But I think that absolutely crucial is that how the classics, and this guy who's educated by the state has no idea of the classical tradition at all, and how poor he is because of that. I think it's
and Orwell similarly was almost contemptuous of what we'll call newfangled kinds of academic discipline. And there's a wonderful letter where he became a friend of the up and coming young philosopher he was then, Freddie Ayer. And he said in a letter to a friend, it says, I've just seen in the paper that Freddie Ayer has been elected Professor of Mental Philosophy at some university. Could you please ask him who is the Professor of Non-Mental Philosophy? Gentleman there.
You were talking about Blair's, George Orwell's Boverism and with his jacket, but wouldn't George Orwell be Eric Blair's Boverism for being the mouthpiece of what he thought was the disappearance of old England or however, and what he thought was important and what he thought others thought would be important, so he would champion it?
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I suppose what I think about there have been as you know, there have been books written about the Blair-Orwell transformation, which happened at the end of 1932, how Eric Arthur Blair became George Orwell. So far as one can gather, it came about pretty much by accident, and that he decided that he wanted to publish Down and Out in Paris and London under a pseudonym, and he initially wanted to just publish it by X. And the publisher said, no, you can't do this. We can't. There's no way we can market a book that's by X. And there's a letter to his agent where he says, I want a pseudonym. I've got to change my name. And the ideas I've come up with are Kenneth Miles, H. Lewis Always, and George Orwell. And I rather fancy George Orwell. But then, having said that, he did. I was assured by the daughter of Eleanor Jakes, who was the woman he knew in Southwold in the early 1930s and very nearly married, that he came home one day to Southwold from, I think he'd been to Ipswich for the day, through which the River Orwell flows. And he apparently walked in and said, I'm going to call myself George Orwell. George is a good brown English, the king's name, and Orwell, it's the big local river here. George Orwell. But I think you're right about the kind of sort of traditional sentiments that it evokes. But I don't think there was any great sort of strategy about that. I think he just thought it was a resonant name that was adopted, I think, almost on the spur of the moment, because the book was about to be published. This was sort of November 1932. The book was published in January, so I think it was kind of plucked from the air, so to speak, and then put on the title page. There wasn't any long period of meditation. Gentlemen.
You've already touched on this a little bit, but it does seem that in, for example, Brideshead Revisited, there's a lot of gluttony for the past and a little bit of fear for the future. And in 1984, there's a lot of fear of the future and a little bit of a lust for the past. So can we rightfully identify these as direct influences from each other, or is it just something they've both identified individually?
That's a lovely question. I mean, I don't think particularly it was from each other, but I think you're absolutely right that it was a lament, certainly for Evelyn. And when he reprinted the book in the 60s, he was quite embarrassed about Brideshead and said it was infused with sort of gluttony and sort of this nostalgia. And he said, he talks about the age of sort of, spam
and this and that,
and privations. And so he said it was suffused, that sort of longing for, but absolutely. And I think, interestingly, with Julia as well, because when particularly Nancy Mitford said, now I believe in God and I talk to him, and she says, and often I make jokes with him, but I just don't think God wants Juliet and Charles not to be together. Now, come on, Evelyn, what's going on here? And she sort of wrote this bossy letter, and he wrote back and said, look, you've got to understand that Julia thinks the world's ending, the world that she knows is ending, and she feels that she has lived a life of sin and she has to make this sacrifice, and she's being pulled back in she's the hook, the twitch on the thread. So she's being reeled back in. And I think that sense of, the world ending, it's a war book, it doesn't come, he's finished it in 1944, and certainly the world he knew had ended, and I think that's why it's such a departure from his other books, Brideshead, in terms of the style and the tone, and at the time he thought it was his magnum opus, but it was later on that he sort of said, well, I'm a bit embarrassed now.
And I think it was the novel of his that Orwell liked least. Actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says in a letter, he can't understand the fuss about Brideshead.
Yeah.
I think the point I would make is that they're both war novels of very different kinds, in that Wars, as Paula has said, is a lament for... he purposely emphasised the sort of the overindulgence and the satiety element of it because he was living in a world of wartime privation. And in fact, as he then, again, as Paula said, he remarked that it was, I think, a panegyric preached over an empty coffin because he was unable to foresee the rise of the National Trust that would, in fact, keep most of the country housed in a pretty decent state of repair. 1984 is a war novel because, although set many years beyond it, the landscapes that Orwell evoked are, in fact, you could almost chart. It was the bus trip he took home on the number 53 down the Strand, past Trafalgar Square and up into North London during 1942-43. And in fact, most of the locales where he's changed the names are the kind of bomb-damaged London streets and squares that he would have gone through on the way home from work. So although he's projecting forward, obviously he's using the sites that he was seeing during the war when he conceived the book, but I don't think it really goes any stronger.
No. And I just simply say at the end, with the light of the tabernacle, the fact is that Waugh sent this very interesting memo to Hollywood when they were trying to make a film of Brideshead, and he said, listen, the chapel and the fountain are the two most important architectural features, and I must see drawings of these before I leave Hollywood. And he said, and the point being that at the end the fountain is desecrated, it's full of cigarette butts, it's full of barbed wire, and that symbolised the worldliness of the March Mains. And the culture, the art, but it's a light in the tabernacle that still burns. So we mustn't, it's a novel about Charles's conversion. I think that's really important.